Right, hello everyone, and thank you, Philip, for your welcome here, and welcome to Ken as well to Melbourne, Australia. It's fantastic to have you here with us.
Well, Kate, it's great to be here. Thank you to the Asia Society for having me, and it's great to be, the COVID icebreaker. So, I'm honored to have that role.
Feels so out of practice for many of us in the room tonight. So this conversation could not come at a more appropriate time. On Tuesday, we had the federal budget announcement here in Australia, where it was announced that the budget for the Australian Human Rights Commission will fall significantly over the next 4 years. This has come at a time during the course of the pandemic where there's been a dramatic increase in the amount of complaints to the Australian Human Rights Commission, emphasising the importance of the national body's work and clear development to improve the national human rights network here in Australia. And today we're going to explore this action and what it means for Asia, in which we include Australia in the region. And what roles can individuals, those of us in the audience, and the many of you watching at home, play in the restoration of human rights and democracy globally? So we're also going to explore the incredible career of our fantastic guest, Kenneth Roth, tonight, the leader of one of the world's premier human rights organisations, Human Rights Watch. He meets with heads of states and foreign ministers around the world. And with a rise of authoritarianism globally, we're going to explore democracy, the rule of law, and how we can prevail and what we can do as individuals, as Australians and global citizens to have a safer, more equitable world. So let's begin with you, Ken, and your career at Human Rights Watch. So you started at Human Rights Watch in 1987, the dying days of the Cold War, the year Ronald Reagan challenged Gorbachev to tear down the wall, and mere 2 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Since then, we've seen what Francis Fukuyama has described as the end of history, in which democracy prevailed over autocracy. Yet today we observe the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We've seen authoritarian governments on the rise and human rights and other global norms on the declines, and as well renewed talk of a Cold War 2.0. So it begs the question then, Ken, what happened between now and 1987?
A simple question, okay?
Start off easy.
Yes. Okay, first of all, I never believed in the end of history. Governments by their nature violate human rights. It's just in the nature of the beast, because they want to stay in power, and there's always this temptation to, twist the rules to do that. So, the role of the human rights community is to push back, to raise the cost of violating human rights. And even if you look at the end of the Cold War, this moment of optimism lasted for about 5 minutes. And then you had, this emergence of ethnic conflict as various kind of ethnic disputes had been held in check by the Cold War and the power balances there. So, we went through a phase there. Then it, looked as if liberal democracy was ascendant. But we've seen, the emergence of leaders who have been able to appeal to really the failures of democracy to deliver to certain segments of society who felt left behind and who were receptive to, demagogic arguments that it's the fault of the immigrants, it's the fault of the minorities. If we somehow could exclude them, our lives would be better. And there are always leaders who are willing to use those kind of arguments, those exploitative arguments to further their agenda. So, there's always going to be kind of a next challenge to the human rights movement. And, at this point, I do think it's the rise of autocracy that is the big challenge, led foremost by China. But we, if you're, a leader, autocracy can be very attractive because it suggests that you can stay in power, you can sort of cripple the opposition. And so, we see the temptation to move in an autocratic direction in many parts of the world. That said, I think we've seen very significant pushback. We can talk about this, but I'm actually at this point somewhat optimistic about how this battle is going. And certainly, what Putin has just done in Ukraine just spotlights the dangers of autocratic rule and is a warning sign to us all that when you have unaccountable governments, they tend to do things that, can be disastrous. They see them as serving themselves, but they can be a disaster for their people or for the world.
Yeah, and as we've seen, as you mentioned, it was this very short period of liberalism that we saw at the end of the Cold War, and many of the same challenges we're still facing today. So on that, what role can multilateral organizations such as the United Nations play in upholding and protecting liberalism, democracy, and as well as human rights?
Well, look, when we talk about the United Nations, I think we have to recognize, in essence, there are two broad parts. There's the operational United Nations, which is led by Antonio Guterres and includes things like, the UN Refugee Agency or the UN Development Program. And then there's the United Nations as a conference room, which is places where governments get together. And, Human Rights Watch, we deal with both parts, but I think when most people talk about the United Nations, they really mean the conference room. And how are governments behaving in that conference room? So if you look at the major bodies for our purposes, it would be the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, the UN Human Rights Council. The Security Council has been utterly stymied by the veto, and it's not just Russia and China, which have been the foremost defenders. They've blocked progress on. You can have a whole range of the most dire human rights problems. But to be fair, it's also the U.S. government that shields Israel and protects Washington's friends. So the UN Security Council, after a kind of a honeymoon toward the end of the Cold War, where China and Russia were being cooperative and it was getting things done, that era is gone. The UN General Assembly has emerged as an occasional fallback. We've seen this in Ukraine now, where the effort to condemn the invasion, the effort to even provide humanitarian assistance, failed because of Russia and China. But the General Assembly came through, overwhelmingly, 141 to 5, 140 to 5. But the General Assembly is really unwieldy. To be able to kind of mobilize all of these governments takes a huge amount of work. We did this, in the midst of the Syrian war, where Russia and China were vetoing access to the International Criminal Court. And so we went to the General Assembly and pushed it to basically create a prosecutor without a court, what's known as the International Impartial Investigative Mechanism, the IIIM, which is basically, currently a French prosecutor. She sits in Geneva, and she puts together evidence for whatever forum becomes available. Recently there was a big trial in Koblenz, Germany, of a Syrian military intelligence officer who was overseeing a torture chamber. He was convicted for crimes against humanity with the help of this UN mechanism. But the General Assembly is kind of rarely where it happens because it's so difficult to work there. The UN Human Rights Council gets a bad reputation because people keep saying, why is Eritrea on the Human Rights Council? Why is China there? Why is Russia there? Fair questions, and a lot of the answer to that is because when the council was created, about 15 years ago or so, from the Human Rights Commission, the problem with the commission is that, its stigma had become so powerful that the various abusive governments of the world were flocking to the commission to undermine its work. And it became just a ridiculous parody of what a human rights body should be. So a new body was set up, the council. And the big innovation was you were going to have elections, and so the worst offenders could be voted off. And for, the first few years, that worked. And every year, I remember we would target, an awful government. They would either withdraw or they would lose. And so we were, having a decent membership. It was never perfect, but it was better. What's happened now is that the regions of the world which nominate candidates are gaming the system. They are nominating the same number of candidates as there are openings, so effectively defeating the election. Occasionally, when they don't do that, we still have progress. So I guess a year and a half ago now, the Asia-Pacific region put forward, shockingly, 5 candidates for 4 openings. It's like, it doesn't usually happen. So Saudi Arabia, the worst candidate, didn't get on. China got the next most votes. So if there had been one more candidate, we would have gotten rid of China. But there wasn't, So that means that this is a very imperfect body. That said, we get tons done there. And, we have had, commissions of inquiry or special rapporteurs or, various bodies created by the Human Rights Council, in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan, now in Ukraine, And so, we don't always win. Like Saudi Arabia was just able to get lifted what's called the Group of Eminent Experts for Yemen, which was a problem because as soon as that oversight was lifted, the number of civilian casualties in Yemen doubled. So these, seemingly technical things like who cares about a UN entity, some body, they matter, in terms of lives. But we still get a lot done. So as imperfect as it is a powerful place to stigmatize governments. Everybody's desperate to avoid condemnation. And it's a way to set up these investigative and reporting mechanisms. The other body just worth mentioning is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, currently Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president. We are currently, I think people know this, in the middle of a bit of a dispute with her over a long-awaited report on Xinjiang, on the crimes against humanity being committed against Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims. And she has been working on this report for 3.5 years. And for most of that time was negotiating with Beijing for what she appropriately sought was unfettered access to do an investigation. Beijing is never going to give her unfettered access. And so finally last September, after being pressed, she said, okay, I'll publish. And I saw her like the next month, and I knew the report was sitting on her desk, and she didn't publish it. And she had one excuse after the other. And now she is actually, I think, on this surmise, but I think because of pressure from Guterres, agreed to Beijing's invitation for a visit. And Beijing has made absolutely clear that it's a friendly visit, not an investigation. So, she's going to go and have a nice, pleasant chit-chat about, 1 million detained Uyghurs and not publish a report until that's done. And this is, it's appalling. And so this is, a real failure of a senior UN official who could easily tomorrow decide to do the opposite, but hasn't.
Definitely. And you mentioned there Russia and China. And one thing that's always struck me about authoritarian regimes like Russia and China is they'll kind of pick and choose from liberal and democratic regimes to get a little bit more authority within the international system. So we have China's democracy with Chinese characteristics. We have Russia saying that its troops in Ukraine are defending genocide, as well as in Myanmar, the military junta there has said that it's defending free and fair elections and that there weren't any free and fair elections in Myanmar. And of course, as well, we have Western democracies who are upholding these rights, but globally they're committing very similar human rights abuses, as you mentioned, in Yemen and also in Iraq. So what does that mean then about the language of democracy and the language of human rights? And can we kind of uphold them as norms and currency within the international regime?
Yeah, Kate, I think it's good news. I think that it means that everybody recognizes that their legitimacy is tied to these international standards. So, you don't see China saying human rights don't matter. They try to redefine human rights. And so for them, they're trying to really equate human rights with, growth in gross domestic product and happiness, whatever that means, But they don't say, we don't care about human rights. And you see this, around the world. Russia even, they all, they'll put an adjective in front of democracy, but they don't say we're ignoring democracy. So that is good because it means that at a fundamental level, they're accepting the norm. They're then trying to twist the norm, either, playing with the facts or playing with the concept. But that, gives those of us who are trying to defend these norms significant power because, in fact, what Human Rights Watch does, in essence, is spotlight the discrepancy between this, nice pretense of respect for democracy and human rights and the ugly reality. And that discrepancy is embarrassing, it's delegitimizing. Governments go to great lengths to avoid it, and that's really how we're able to influence governments by, getting them to recognize that they're not going to get rid of this criticism until they change the conduct. So, I think that's good news. Now, of course, governments increasingly feel that they can just lie through their teeth. And, because they have gotten more sophisticated about using social media, about using propaganda outlets, they all have their own, slick TV stations now. They think that they can just sort of change public perception of reality. And to some extent they can. This is a serious challenge. It's why careful fact-finding, matters, but you also have to, it's not enough just to state the truth. You've got to then disseminate it in a persuasive way. And in many ways, this is the challenge of our time. And it's, it's very Trumpian, but it goes way beyond Trump. In the sense that, facts are just flexible and you can play with them however you want. I don't believe in that. I actually do think that truth tends to prevail. And a lot of why a group like Human Rights Watch is able to have influence is because ultimately we win these debates about the facts. But it is harder than it used to be because it used to be that you would really mediate these debates through a handful of respected journalistic outlets. And now you have to mediate it through social media and, large-scale propaganda outfits that are obviously more difficult to control. So, your question, I think it's good news that they're playing games with these standards because they're accepting at least the language, and our task is to, reinforce the genuine meaning of that language and then push toward, the truth rather than some concoction of the truth.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned at the start there the kind of adjective and then democracy. We have guided democracies, and you mentioned in the foreign affairs piece the concept of zombie democracies.
Yeah.
So these democracies which kind of have the veneer of being a democracy, but when you get down to the substance, it's really lacking. They have state-controlled media, a lack of free and fair elections.
Yeah, zombie democracy was my adjective rather than theirs. They like to say it's, guided democracy or whatever. But, the emergence of zombie democracy, I actually think is also positive because until relatively recently, autocrats thought that it was sufficient to manipulate democracy. And so, they would maybe censor a few media outlets, disqualify a few candidates, tilt the playing field enough so they could, predictably prevail. And what has emerged over the last couple of years in particular is they've lost confidence in the ability to manipulate elections. And this is partly, I think, because there has been this, outpouring of popular support for democracy. In this region, we've seen it, most visibly in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Myanmar. But it's a global phenomenon. It's Belarus, it's Russia, it's Sudan, it's Uganda, it's Cuba, Nicaragua. You see this every place where, when it really becomes a contested issue, people are taken to the streets at risk of arrest or even being shot and standing up for democracy. So with that, prospect of, a strong popular desire for the real thing, not this fake thing, these autocratic leaders increasingly recognize that they're not going to get away with a mere manipulated election. And so this is where you get these utter electoral charades, where, Lukashenko in Belarus disqualifies all the leading candidates. It turns out that the wife of them, one of them, completely wins the election, and so he has to then shut down the election. Ortega in Nicaragua did the same thing. 7 leading presidential candidates just arrested. Putin did this with the recent Duma elections, where there was no real opposition. And, Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, his great offense, what got him almost killed with Novichok poisoning and currently imprisoned, is that he figured out that even though there are no real opposition candidates, he can severely embarrass United Russia, the ruling party, by guiding people to vote for the least bad alternative. And so he had this smart voting. And he would just, for every constituency, he would say, okay, the least awful candidate, hold your nose and vote for this person. And the point is that then the United Russia candidate would lose. And that was so threatening that Putin, had to have him locked up. So increasingly we see these, zombie elections emerge, which you could say, oh, this is just the strong men being strong, but it's actually a sign of weakness. Because if you can get away with a manipulated election, you do, because it still confers some legitimacy. But zombie elections confer no legitimacy at all. It's just a charade to kind of keep people from completely rebelling. But it gets them nothing in terms of legitimacy. And it's not a sustainable long-term strategy.
Yeah. What then explains the support amongst populations for these leaders that are more likely to turn to autocratic tendencies, zombie elections, and those?
Well, look at that. But the people who resort to zombie elections have pretty much lost their public. So I think the real question is more in places where there is still, some form of election. Why is it that, an Orban in Hungary or an Erdogan in Turkey or a Trump in the United States, why are they able to prevail? And, I do think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. There are certain leaders who have figured out how to appeal to people's grievances. Usually it's a more rural population that's not benefiting from the economic growth that a country might be enjoying. And these autocratic leaders almost invariably demonize some unpopular minority. And so it's almost always immigrants, sometimes it's gays, sometimes it's women. But it's something that is appealing to this, more conservative element of society that explains why they are discontent, why they feel less behind. And, and that can work. Our societies are deeply divided, and you can sometimes secure almost a majority or kind of a plurality through these anti-rights appeals. And so, this is a challenge for us. And it shows the importance of, looking beyond mere elections and bolstering, a sense of respect for the rights of everybody, including minorities. Obviously, once these autocrats get in power, they then make it harder to challenge them, because the first thing they do is attack the checks and balances on their authority. And so they go after the media, they go after civil society organizations, they go after independent judges, they sometimes try to restrict, the parliament. And there's a kind of classic, autocrats playbook that they all run through. And it is very important to try to defend these broader institutions of democracy. The European Union is in the midst of this right now with Poland and Hungary. And they just, the European Court of Justice just gave them the authority to condition these huge subsidies to Poland and Hungary on respect for what they call the rule of law, but that's kind of the surrogate for these broader set of issues. And then Ukraine happened. And they're not going to cut off aid to Poland while it's receiving 2 million Ukrainian refugees. So this whole thing is on hold for a moment. But there is, I think, recognition in Europe that they are, at risk of no longer being a club of democracies if they allow Orban and Kaczynski to move, to proceed on their current path.
Yeah. What about the role of technology and social media in the maintenance of democracy or the rise of authoritarians? We're seeing, you open TikTok or Twitter and you can see human rights abuses being committed in Ukraine, in the Middle East as well. How does technology and social media influence this?
Look, as in any innovation, it's double-edged. So, the positive side of social media, first of all, it is democratizing with respect to voice. So, if you have a concern or a grievance, it used to be you would have to persuade some journalist to write about it. Now you just post it on Twitter or Instagram or what have you. And, if it's something that resonates, it will move. So there is a deeply democratizing element of social media that I think is important. It also helps to organize people. We're using social media today in Ukraine because Human Rights Watch, in addition to having investigators on the ground, we have people, open source investigators who are scraping social media, taking the videos that people inevitably post there of bombings and the like, and verifying that against the testimonies we take, against satellite imagery. This is like all important evidence of war crimes. This is a great new tool that wasn't available pre-social media. The flip side of this, of course, that everybody's aware of is that social media is not, it's also the anti-rights people who similarly now have a platform without having to go through journalists. And so it's easier to spread disinformation. It's easier to spread divisiveness and hatred. And the social media companies are grappling with this. They all know they're supposed to try to limit that, but they are reluctant to take the steps that are really required. They're not investing what they should in the kind of linguistic and cultural skills needed to really read what postings on social media mean. They also are still being completely proprietary and non-transparent with the algorithms that are maximizing engagement, which tends to promote the divisiveness. It's the horrible things that tend to spread more widely, and engagement is profitable. So they're trying to help, but they're really not tackling the heart of the problem. So it is double-edged, and I think we have to, profit from the good parts, but try to constrain the bad parts.
Yeah, constrain the kind of corporatization of airing these human rights violations that we're seeing as well. It can be great as a tool of organizing, as we saw in the Middle East in the Spring Revolution.
Precisely.
Yeah. Do you think, zooming in a little bit more into our region, what do you think are some of the biggest human rights challenges in Asia? And do you think that democracy and human rights are inherently interlinked terms?
Well, let me take your second question first. I think human rights are a necessary element of democracy. If some people just kind of reduce democracy to elections, I think that's a mistake. What democracy means is, of course, periodic free elections, but also, a free press, freedom to organize, a range of political parties, a diversity of voices, and, the rule of law, meaning the, ability to hold governments to respect the core rights of their people. And without that panoply of rights and constraints, you don't really have democracy. You can have an elected authoritarian government. We've seen that. So I do not distinguish between democracy and human rights. I treat democracy as sort of, the ultimate, the end point when you have broad respect for human rights. I mean, in this region, look, if we're going to talk about threats, we have to start with China. And I view China as by far and away the greatest threat to the global human rights system. And I start really from the premise that, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, obviously, they don't hold elections, so they don't have that route to legitimacy. And so they are very dependent on kind of international acceptance as a measure of their legitimacy. And if they can show other governments treating them with respect, it enables them to tell the Chinese people, they were recognized as important leaders, and that helps maintain control, which is what it's all about. So the Chinese government has gone about trying to undermine the human rights system in every way that it can. And one way to think about the Belt and Road Initiative is not simply as an infrastructure development program, which it obviously is in part, but also as a way to buy votes in UN fora to try to avoid not simply criticism of China, which is the core, but really most criticism of governments, because China really is trying to translate human rights from standards that have to be enforced, including through pressure. They want to reduce human rights to a nice topic of conversation that we all cooperatively in a win-win relationship, all get better. And it's, which means everybody gets to do their own thing. And that is the conception of human rights that China is promoting, which is nothing. It means complete deference to each government to do whatever they want with their people, and no international constraint or on that latitude. So that is, that's a big challenge. And of course, if you look domestically in China, it's not a theoretical concern. We have crimes against humanity being committed in Xinjiang. We have, by far and away the most repressive situation in China since the Tiananmen Square massacre, where civil society has been decimated. The kind of movement toward the rule of law has been reversed. There really are, very few independent voices that are permitted. And, one way to understand what happened to Hong Kong is that, Xi Jinping says the Chinese people have accepted this trade-off. I'm making their lives better. They're richer because of, Chinese Communist Party rule. And so they're happy with us. And the one territory under government control where people had any ability to voice what they really thought was Hong Kong. And the people, took to the streets in massive numbers to avoid anything approaching a Communist Party dictatorship. When it was possible to vote in LegCo elections, they were voting against the Communist Party candidates. The ultimate offense was to hold, an informal primary, which would have made it more possible for the pro-democratic forces to take over the LegCo, and that was the end. And then the national security law was passed, and basically, the core freedoms of Hong Kong were decimated. So you got to begin there, and that is, it's not just a regional challenge; it really is a global challenge.
And this is, I think, picking up on China and Australia's relationship with China. It's the question that everyone gets asked when they come to Australia. But how can Australia manage its advocacy for genocide in China, as well as its trade relations with China? We've seen in 2020 the effects of the tariffs there as well, and also whilst managing our superpower competition between the United States and China. Australia has long picked the United States as its closest ally. So how does Australia manage both its relationship with competition in regards to China and the United States, and also its economic interests and its human rights advocacy?
Okay, well, first, I think it's very important, Kate, to separate the human rights issue from the geopolitical competition. And I think it's wrong to say, oh, I'm not going to focus so much on human rights because I'm worried that it might be used in the geopolitical competition. I mean, when you have people facing such severe repression, you have a duty to stand up for them. and not sit here and worry about, oh, is Washington going to play games with this, or is somebody going to use it for propaganda purposes? You just got to stand up for these people and do what you can. Now, I'm not a great fan of the Morrison government, but they've done the right thing courageously on China. And it has hurt Australia. I mean, I think the answer, if you sort of say, how can Australia continue to stand up for human rights without being pummeled by Beijing, we actually answer this question around the world. Because when we go to governments and say, will you condemn what's happening in Xinjiang, their first reaction is, I don't want to be like Australia, Or, I mean, the other one that they say is, Norway, where after Liu Xiaoping, what's his name? Liu Xiaoping, yes, Xiaoping. The Nobel Peace Prize winner, Norwegian salmon was stuck with tariffs, even though the Norwegian government had nothing to do with the Nobel Peace Prize. But nonetheless, so people want to avoid that. And the answer we've given is there's safety in numbers. China can't retaliate against everybody. And so we've helped to organize a series of joint statements aimed at condemning principally Xinjiang. And we did this first about 2.5 years ago at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And at that point got 23 governments to sign on to this joint statement. And obviously, China couldn't retaliate against 23 governments. They were still so scared, though, that there's a tradition at the council that when there is a joint statement like this, somebody goes and reads it out loud before the council. And nobody would do that. And so, finally the British government came in and said, okay, we'll do it. But we've now we're at 44 governments, and there hasn't been retaliation. And so I think, the answer for Australia is to work with partners on this, not to give up, not to treat this as just geopolitical competition, treat it as a matter of principle, but try to broaden that group. And so I actually think the next step, most of these 44 are still Western governments, and there are some exceptions. Turkey is now on this, but I think the aim next should be to go after, moderate Muslim majority countries who are concerned about their compatriots in Xinjiang, the democracies of Latin America or Africa, which sometimes can be brought along on these things. And, again, they're all worried about China, but they've been willing to take pro-right stands in other circumstances. So this is not a hopeless cause by any means. And, Australia obviously has, kind of special relations in the Pacific, so they can bring along governments here. But these numbers matter because we are approaching the point where it is possible to win a resolution at the Human Rights Council on China, which has never happened. And the Chinese are desperate to avoid that. And these things, again, matter. I mean, we're even now, when you talk to the Chinese, they say, well, people are graduating from, they don't say the detention centers because they're not detention centers. These are, what is it? They talk about sort of, ways of kind of, improving.
Yeah, re-education.
Yeah. And so they're graduating, but what they're graduating into is forced labor. So that's an evolution. It's not necessarily an improvement. But they are, they're reacting. And so I just think we need to keep the pressure on. That's the only way we're going to, preserve any remnants of the Uyghur culture, which Beijing is absolutely determined to eradicate.
Looking at what Australia can do now in terms of the promotion of democracy in the region, is it a matter that Australia has a place to promote democracy in the region, or should we clean up our own house first? Human Rights Watch has highlighted Australia's treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, the offshore detention programs in PNG, Nauru, and even hotels here in Melbourne, as well as an overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians in our justice system. So is it a matter of cleaning up our own house, or does Australia have a place for the promotion of democracy and human rights?
Right, it's both. Yeah. It's not either or. Okay, and so yes, Australia should clean up its own house. Its treatment of asylum seekers as warehousing of people in these remote offshore systems, or even when they're brought into Australia, giving them no status, detaining them in these hotels forever. I'm so glad that Djokovic got expelled because it just highlighted the plight of these people, and it really helped improve their lives in many cases. But so yes, that needs to be cleaned up. The treatment of the Aboriginal population is horrible. So there's big progress to be made. But every government has human rights problems. That is not an excuse to kind of refrain from promoting human rights in foreign policy. And so I don't accept that it's an either or. And Australia does clearly have a duty, not simply with respect to China, but in the region as a whole. And I've been concerned that Australia, strong as it's been on China, has been pulling its punches elsewhere. And if you just look at, Australia's attitude toward Myanmar, where here, the junta has killed, 1,600 people. It's, detained thousands upon thousands. It's now engaged in, sort of a series of counterinsurgency efforts that have involved, what they did with the Rohingya, where it's like burning villages and, these clearance operations, which are just basically, destroying villages and killing civilians. Australia stands out among kind of the major Western governments that are committed to human rights as not having imposed sanctions on the junta. So unlike the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, European Union, Australia hasn't done this. And you ask the government, well, why? And they talk about, we're letting ASEAN lead, which is like utterly unpersuasive because everybody else is also letting ASEAN lead, but that hasn't stopped them from imposing sanctions. And ASEAN, is doing a miserable job. They've got commitment to this 5-point plan. None of the 5 points have been implemented, including releasing political prisoners or stopping the violence. And so, fine, you can defer to ASEAN, in the front, but don't pretend that that's the solution. And I suspect what really is going on here is the Australian government is much too worried about competition with China with respect to ASEAN. And here, I think it's important to focus on the means as well as the ends. So the ends, which is, try to promote human rights in China, great, But if the means to do that are to ignore human rights in, other countries, that completely defeats the long-term purpose. Your ability to defend human rights depends significantly on consistency, on being principled. And so the idea is, we're going to ignore human rights violations here in order to promote human rights violations there. That is a illogic. That does not work. And I'm afraid that Australia has fallen into that a bit with the soft touch that it is treating, the many dictatorships within ASEAN.
Yeah, picking and choosing which human rights issues it chooses to act on.
Or not acting, yes.
Right. Exactly. So thank you so much, Ken, for your insights during that discussion. We'll now turn to the audience Q&A. So a reminder to keep your questions short, keep it questions, not comments. So Elise is around with a roaming mic, so feel free to pop your hand up. Yep, someone will come with the mic shortly.
Hi, Ken. Thanks so much. Andrew Hudson from the Centre for Policy Development. Great to have you in Australia. Thanks for your insight, as always. I think we've all been shocked at the actions of Putin in Ukraine. And I guess, how do you think that this will embolden other autocrats around the world, especially in our region? What are some of your fears for the repercussions?
Well, Andrew, good to see you. I have to say, I think Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a disaster for the world's autocrats. In part because so many of them had cozied up to Putin, had been photographed with him, and Putin is not the most credible character these days. But what he did in Ukraine really spotlights the dangers of unaccountable autocratic rule, and the ruthlessness with which he has proceeded in Ukraine. With his classic indiscriminate bombardment of civilians is, horrifying everybody. So that, that from just an ideological perspective, it makes, autocratic rule less attractive. The Western response, or the global response, has also been very powerful. And, I'm sure that Xi Jinping is unhappy with the unity that people have shown with respect to the invasion of Ukraine, because that suggests that there could be something comparable were China to try to take Taiwan militarily. And, I think that, obviously, you can ask why is Xi Jinping kind of lukewarm toward this whole thing. I think he's trying to keep a certain distance from Putin because, he too is embarrassed by, the Brothers Forever kind of thing that he did around the time of the Beijing Olympics. And, nobody at this point wants to be too close to Putin. But he's not going to distance himself too much from Putin either, because Xi Jinping would love to see this sort of broader sanctions effort fail. He would love to see the West dissolve into disunity. The kind of unified willingness to stand up, not simply for sovereignty, but also for the basic requirements of humanitarian law, which Putin has ripped up in Ukraine. That, is the opposite of what he wants. He's really trying to, undermine any kind of human rights standard and certainly undermine any willingness to enforce those standards. So I think, even though, I don't want to overshadow the fact that this is a disaster for the people of Ukraine. And there are thousands upon thousands of people being killed. There are 4 million refugees, 10 million displaced. So this is, from that perspective, it's a human rights disaster, plain and simple. But if you seriously, what are the repercussions of this? I think it hurts the autocratic tendencies that we've seen for these two broad reasons.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that one. Any other questions?
Hi, my name's Harold Weldon. I'm from my own consultancy, Benefactum. Just a quick question about Jan 6, Washington. What's your feeling about the next election in the US and those issues of autocracy?
Yeah. Well, look, January 6th was an utterly ham-fisted, amateurish effort to reverse the results of an election. Your question is exactly the right one, because it's the next election that we have to worry about. Because obviously, Trump has learned from this. And the next attempt to reverse an election is going to be done much more professionally. And it's not simply the voter suppression that gets a lot of attention. The thing that I think is most worrisome is, the U.S. already has kind of a weird electoral system. You all know about, the Electoral College, and also it's not direct elections. But what people don't realize is that there's always this presumption that the delegates to the Electoral College, which are chosen state by state, are simply, from the party that won that state's presidential election. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. The Constitution allows a degree of latitude, and the statute governing this is poorly written. And there is now an effort to empower state legislatures to choose the delegates to the Electoral College. And what we're all worried about is that these state legislators in a close election in their state will say, too much fraud, we just don't really know what happened, we're just going to decide that Trump won, and we're going to send the pro-Trump delegates to the Electoral College. That's the game plan right now. And there is an effort to tighten the statute that regulates these things. Unclear if that's going to succeed. It's going to, require some Republicans going along with it. And there are obviously some decent Republican senators, so it's possible that you get the votes needed to overcome a filibuster, but it's not clear in this very divided, divisive situation. But that's the risk, that, January 6th was a practice test, and that, a more sophisticated effort would be made in 2024 were Trump to run, lose the election, and not be willing to accept that result.
All right, thank you for that one. Yes, perfect.
Thank you. My name is Ateli. I'm a development activist. You talked about Asia. Would you touch on India, who apparently has up to 50% of its defense expenditure, relying on Russia, for example. So if you can stress on India.
Yes, well, India, many people have commented on Modi's, neutrality with respect to the Ukraine invasion. And you've pointed to a big part of that, which is, the reliance on Russian, military supplies and arms. I think it's a bit more than that, too, in that India traditionally does not like to criticize any government for its, human rights or other conduct. I think mainly because of Kashmir. It just doesn't want people focused on country condemnations because it's, worried that it would come back to haunt them. And this is, of course, also at a time when the BJP has been, openly fomenting anti-Muslim sentiment, sometimes even violence, and Modi has done nothing to stop that. I think it sees it as politically profitable. What I worry about, and this is a comment on Australia's policy, but also the US government's and others, is that because India is seen as an important counter to China, there is a tendency to simply ignore this very troubling trend, including effectively shutting down human rights and environmental groups, severely restricting civil society, restricting the media. This in a country that is still a democracy, still is, has elements of a vibrant civil society, but it's becoming much more constrained under the BJP. And so, again, I'm afraid that one of these, compromise on the means to secure a laudable end is going on with respect to India. And everybody is pulling their punches toward India, which I think is a big mistake.
You see that in Australia with the Quad states
yes,
as well, and grappling with that one.
Yeah.
And just in the middle there.
And I should say this is not a commentary on the Quad. In other words, as a military alliance, fine. India is a key partner in that, but that should not justify silence with respect to the anti-Muslim sentiment and violence or the broader crackdown on civil society in India.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. My name is Molina Asthana from the Law Institute of Victoria. But probably following on from the conversation we just had about India, I guess scrutinizing human rights violations in the global south, they're always under much more scrutiny than what happens in the West, including ourselves here in Australia. We don't even have a Bill of Rights. And our Human Rights Commission, Australian Human Rights Commission, barely has any teeth. Whereas India has a very strong, and I'm just taking India because I come from India, has a very strong human rights, a culture as well in courts, and I practice there. So the public interest litigation is massive. So the democracy is quite vibrant, but scrutiny of the global south is much more than what it is of the West, even though the violations may be equal sometimes, if not more. So I would just want to hear your comments on that.
No, I take your point about the scrutiny. And I think it's absolutely important to scrutinize everybody. It's not widely known, but the largest country team by far at Human Rights Watch is the country team that focuses on the United States. And I think that's appropriate. The U.S. is a very complicated place. It has serious problems. And so, we do massive amounts of work around, racial injustice in the criminal justice system, around, the immigration abuses, particularly on the southern borders, around the kind of, electoral fraud that we were discussing earlier. Here in Australia, we do work. Just yesterday, we put something out around kind of the treatment of people in care homes who are subject to what we call chemical restraints, but basically just drugging them in order to control them, rather than having the personnel needed to care for them. We've done a massive amount of work in Australia on, just the outrage of the warehousing of people in Manus and Nauru, and the broader just, flouting of international asylum and refugee standards. We're doing work on, the rights of indigenous people. And we try to do this in Western democracy. We don't do them in all. We just don't really have the capacity at this stage. But particularly places where we have a more significant presence, so in the UK and in France and Germany, we're much more involved. And I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't scrutinize differently. And that doesn't mean that everybody violates the same amount. I do think violations are more severe in some places than others. And that is the biggest guide to how we allocate our resources. But it's important that everybody gets scrutinized, and these are really global standards.
We might have time for one more question. Yep.
Sorry. I was just going to say, how do you respond to the thoughts of sanctions against zombie democracy? Sorry. Just like, for example, in Russia, the effects of the economic sanctions on the Russian citizens, where they have limited control over who's in power.
That's a good question, because I do fear that the sanctions imposed on Russia are overbroad and are at a certain point counterproductive. The sanctions targeting the government leadership, governing people who may be financing this, some of the oligarchs, certainly the military, arms suppliers. I mean, there are a range of people and institutions that are very appropriate targets. And you could even justify, the sanctions against the reserves because, effectively that's money that the government could be using to purchase arms and to kind of resupply the troops in Ukraine. Where I think it's gone overboard, and this is partly the sanctions, but it's also a lot of it is just the corporate response because, much of this is just companies really subject to public pressure saying we've got to pull out of Russia because the public is just not tolerating our presence there. And the fear is that a lot of this is turning the Russian people into the enemy. And I think that that's a mistake, first just as a matter of principle. I mean, they're not responsible. They don't really get to vote. But also because if you say, what's the greatest potential constraint on Putin, it is the Russian people. Putin is terrified of a so-called color revolution. The prospect that the people would rise up and oust the autocrat. And so he is very sensitive to public opinion. That's why he's going to such lengths today to censor, any independent media, to spread all this disinformation. He didn't even bother preparing the Russian people for this war because he was afraid how they would react. It's not even a war, of course. It's just a special military operation to, stop genocide in the Donbass and, denazify Ukraine. It's all this, this disinformation that's out there. And so I think it's important that any sanction keep in mind that the Russian people are ultimately our best potential allies in limiting this indiscriminate warfare in Ukraine. And I'll just give one example. There are many people in Russia who still are trying to get access to independent information. And the best tool for that is using a VPN, a virtual private network. Now, most Russians gain access to VPNs by paying for them with an international credit card, all of which are now dying because of the sanctions, which means their VPN subscriptions are going to die with that. This is completely counterproductive. We want the Russian people to be totally informed. And so, I've been talking around to various governments saying, would somebody please just pay for free VPN subscriptions for every Russian who wants it, we want the Russian people informed. And that's just, one small example, but we just have to keep in mind that it's the government that is the offender here. It's not the Russian people.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. We've got a couple of minutes left, so thank you so much, Ken, for joining us here in Melbourne tonight and all of your travels globally. It's been fantastic to have you. I think it's a great point to end on is democracy and human rights lies in the power of the people, and it's the government that are committing these atrocities as opposed to the citizens of the country. So thank you so much for being here tonight.